Hello and welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Ann Hess. Joining us is Dr. Al Kurtz, and today our topic is centered around cold stress in calves, specifically if it's better to house calves in pairs in times of cold temperatures. Before we get into today's session, a reminder that if you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area to the right of your screen. Or if you're joining us from social media, simply post those questions directly in those channels. Welcome, Dr. Kurtz, and great to have you back with us.
Thank you, Ann. It may sound a little strange to be talking about cold stress because where I am and in the Midwest, we're still having heat stress. But it actually, in the northern states in the U.S. and in Mountain West with higher elevations, even with high temperatures during the day, there's cold stress at night. And as we found out when we talked recently about heat stress, there isn't that much data on that, and there isn't that much data on cold stress. So in this case, we're going to deal with a study that looks at cold stress and with single or paired housing. Now let's talk a minute about cold stress in young calves. Anything below about 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit is cold stress. So it's not unusual now to have nights at that level, as I said, especially in the northern climates in the U.S. Now, in cold stress in young calves is more of an issue because they, like human infants, they don't manage their body temperature very well. They also have the highest surface area of the body mass compared to cows, so they're more susceptible to cold temperatures. And there are ways of trying to minimize cold stress, such as putting blankets on calves, making sure that uh, they have a deep straw bedding so you get insulation value. And, they will really hunker down and put their feet even below the surface of the straw to keep warmer. And then feeding. Feeding wise, you can feed more of a milk or milk replacer, a higher fat milk replacer. And the other element that isn't often thought about is calf starter intake. The more calf starter that the calf consumes, the more it is fermented in the rumen, and that produces heat of rumen fermentation, which helps meet their energy needs. And that's why cows do much better during the winter than during the summer, because in the summer, if they want to cut down on their heat of rumen fermentation, they eat less, and that's not what we want them to do. And as far as I know, and I thought about this, all large animals that go through cold climates in the winter that don't hibernate are ruminants because it's like having an internal furnace or heat source with the fermentation of the diet that they're consuming. And the more fibrous the diet is, the more heat of fermentation there is. So let's go back to this study then. It's done with hutches, and according to the last NOM study that was 10 years ago, about 63% of calf housing was in hutches. And so this led to a study at the University of Wisconsin Madison Dairy Farm. They used 48 Holstein heifer calves, and they were either housed individually, there were 16 of those individually housed, or in pairs. So that was 32. So that's where the 48 comes from. And then they were a 2x2 factorial, and it was conducted from December of 2019 to March of 2020. So that's generally all cold stress during that period of the day and night in that part of the country. Now, these calves were from the university herd. They were, if they were over 106 pounds, they were not used, trying to control the amount of variation that you have when you deal with calf studies. And then they also tried to, in the pairs, minimize the range of body weight within 22 pounds. And the average was 4 pounds, but plus or minus 8.6. So you can see how much variation there was. And then they within a given pair, they tried to keep the age within about 2 days so that there isn't a big difference in age or weight of these calves when they were paired. They were when they started out, they were about 87 pounds. One of groups that was a single, and the pair house 85, so about 2 pounds difference. Not a big difference. So now they had a outdoor area, 4 feet by 6 feet when they were singly housed, and then the pair housed had two adjacent hutches. They were connected with a white plastic board in an outdoor area so they could go in and out. And then during the day, during a 1 hour period, they were both kept together for some observations and measurements. But otherwise, they could come and go from one hutch to another. And let's see what else. They were okay. They were fed hot water in plastic pail 3 times a day at 6 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and 6 in the evening. That is incredibly good practice. I've been advocating that for a number of years. If you feed hot water, let's say twice a day after they've been fed the milk replacer, they will generally drink it before it freezes, and that encourages them to eat more starter, which is what you want them to do because that helps the rumen fermentation and the heat of fermentation. If you add a third feeding, then you also ensure that they're going to drink more water and have more feed consumed. If you don't use hot water and you use cold water, it's going to freeze quicker, and when the calf drinks it, they have to use energy to warm up the cold water. So that's not a good deal. So that was a good plus here in this particular study. They were fed 2 quarts of pasteurized waste milk twice a day for about 4 days, and then they increased it to 3 quarts twice a day and went up to 4 quarts twice a day. Now, when they were going to wean them, they went in a step-down fashion. So let's look at that. They decreased to 2 quarts twice a day from 4 quarts at day 42 of age. Now that's cutting it in half. That's a pretty big decrease. Then they went to 2 quarts once a day on day 49. They were a week on twice a day, 2 quarts. Then on day 49, they went to once a day, 2 quarts. And then on day 53, they were completely weaned. I wish there were calf starter data here because then that would have indicated to us how well they went through that transition of their step down process, because I'm concerned that with the high level feeding of the milk, they might not have done as well in increasing their starter intake. But that's another part of the story we can talk about some other time. So then on day 3, they were fed a texturized starter, which is a good plus. It had 43.5% corn, which is good. So that's almost the minimum amount of texture you want. I usually say about 45%. They had 28.5% cottonseed hull pellets, which aren't necessary if you would up the corn level. And then they also fed 2.8% roasted soybeans. And that's not necessary. In fact, it could be partly negative because of the fat content in the roasted soybeans. So now let's look at the first table and see what they found. The average numbers there that you see are degrees Fahrenheit. So some of you would relate better to centigrade. And you see in the pair housed calves in week 4, the mean was 28.2 versus the individually housed was 25.3. So there's almost a 3-degree difference, a lower temperature when they were individually housed. And that's most likely because when the calves are together in a single hutch, then they would warm the atmosphere within that hutch a bit, and that in this case about 3 degrees. You see that quite a range there, 17.6 to 20 to 33.3, and so on. Now the week 5, there was 26.6, so it's colder for the pair housed versus 28.4, so not as big a spread. And actually, it went the other direction, and don't know why that happened. And then in week 6, individual housed, it was 31.1, 31.3, so they were the same. But it looks like during the week 4 was the biggest advantage on the temperature difference. Now, they also took some other measurements. They had ocular and rectal temperatures. They didn't find much difference there. They looked at how much time they spent in their hutches. And when they were pair housed, they spent a bit more time in the hutches, and that's most likely because they enjoyed their own company better when they're paired than when single housed. And let's see, they were together in the same hutch at the same time, about 90% versus about 80% of the observations for week 4, 6, and 9, respectively. So there's some difference from week to week. Now, their birth weights were not different. They're, only 2 pounds, so it wasn't much of a difference there. Now, if we look at the figures, we'll see that there's a rather consistent pattern here. So figure 8, figure 8, the section A has body weights. And notice that at day 42, 53, and 59, that the pair housed calves had a bit more weight in each of those periods of time. But notice the bars on there, the variation bars, they're quite wide. So that kept this from being a statistically significant difference because of the wide variation you get even in body weights. Now, if we look at section B, which is the dry matter intake, we don't see much difference pre-weaning, but at weaning we see some increase in the pair housed, and we see more intake in the post-weaning. But again, with the variation, no statistically significant differences. Now, if we look at section C, average daily gain, we see the same pattern. Some numerical increase, even pre-weaning, a bit more post-weaning and weaning for the pair housed versus the singular housed. And then when we do the feed conversion ratio, you'll see that there's a slight advantage for the pair house versus the group house. So the pattern is very clear here. There is some advantage for the pair house versus the individual house. But the reason that there's no statistically significant difference is because of the variation, there aren't enough calves. There were 16 singular house and a pair of 16. So even though that might calculate statistically that you should have a difference, with the variation, you don't get it. And that's something I looked at a number of years ago. It's difficult many times to get enough calves for treatments because it depends on the size of the herd, the calving pattern, and even the season of the year. So I think that this indicates there is some advantage for pair house calves in the winter, but it was not significant because we would need more calves. And the best example I can think of is, and I mentioned it at the end of the article, is the impact of the daily gain of calves and what kind of cows and how much milk they produce in their first lactation. That was done at Cornell University, where they had a 10-year database with over 1,000 calves. There were some individual studies that tended to indicate this, but it took a large database like that in order to show that, yes, there is a significant effect on the daily gain of calves before weaning and how well they do as cows. So our message here is There's probably some advantage here. We didn't see the statistically significant differences because there weren't enough calves.
A reminder to post any questions you might have for Dr. Kurtz, and Al's column is on this topic is posted there in the chat. If you'd like to take a closer look at it, you can also read his column in their September digital edition of Feedstuffs that will be coming to your email inbox this week. So, Dr. Kurtz, I just have a question. I'm just thinking it's still warm here, as we talked about in the
Yes.
beginning of this. Have you seen a disadvantage in the summer when they're housed together? It'd be heat stress and more, maybe not eating as much?
Well, we reviewed that, let's see, in a previous study that was done at Wisconsin, where they looked at that. And it depends on how significant the heat stress is. And in Wisconsin, you're not going to get as severe heat stress as you will in the southeast, because in the southeast you not only have high temperature but you have high humidity, and it's that combination of what we call a temperature humidity index that creates a heat stress. So that can be calculated and measured and can help you decide how much you might want to try to mitigate it. And the biggest thing to do in the summertime with heat stress is make sure the calves have shade and that they have ventilation. And sometimes the hutches aren't well ventilated, or the dairy doesn't open the backside as much as it can be in order to do a better job of ventilation. But even in that case, as I recall, the Wisconsin study found that the calves preferred some company, even if there was some heat stress going on.
Sure. I know you've talked about the importance of getting that hot water to them, but what is the bottom line in all this? What's some key takeaways for producers?
Well, the reason you want it hot, probably not too hot so they can't put their nozzle in it, but is because it's going to freeze. And that was the common complaint I always heard from dairies when I said you need to provide more water in the wintertime, because they don't think of the calves needing water in the wintertime as they do during the summertime. And so my analogy there is, when you see a calf's breath, every time they breathe out, they're losing moisture. And that's because they take in dry air in the winter, they warm it up, and it gets humidified in their lungs. And when they breathe out, they're losing moisture. And that's why you see their breath. So they're losing moisture in the wintertime. You just don't think of it that way. So the reason to warm the water is twofold. One is so they'll drink it. And the other one is so that when it goes into the rumen, it's not going to drop the rumen temperature when they have to use body heat then to warm up the rumen contents, and the bacteria, of course, aren't going to work as well until the contents are warmed up. There's a study that I know is referenced in my book, done in South Dakota, I think in 1968, in which they measured rumen temperatures in calves with some monitors when they fed them different temperature water. And it'll take a half an hour or 45 minutes for the calves to warm up colder temperature water to rumen temperature. So that's a period of time when they're losing energy because they have to warm the water up, and you're losing rumen activity because bacteria don't function well at a lower temperature.
So you're weighing in here. Would you say pairs are probably working better than individually housed in the winter specifically?
I would think so, and based on these studies. And then the thing is, if you're going to pair house them in a single hutch, you should have a larger hutch because you don't have as much space per animal. And in this case, they were going from one hutch to congregate together in another hutch. But I think you should have more space for them, even in wintertime, although it's a little more space for them to stay warmer.
Dr. Al Kurtz, we appreciate you joining us and sharing your insight today.
All right, Ann, thank you.
We also appreciate you for joining us today. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format on feedstuffs.com. For Feedstuffs 365, I'm Ann Hess.